Daf Pei Gimel Amud Aleph will begin Daf Pei Beis Amud Beis, 4 lines from the bottom. We learned in the Mishnah there was a machlokes of Chachamim and Rav Yochanan ben Broka. We learned that the Pesach that became Tomei was Yotze Tomei, then it's burnt immediately. But if it's a tumah with the Balim or it died, then Tu B'Tzaros, it has to be delayed until the next morning. But Rav Yochanan ben Broka said, Avzeh, he says Yisoras Miyad. He says if the owners became tummy, even though it's not inherent in the korban, but we don't consider it to be external because the korban Pesach has to be eaten. And if the owners are tummy, even though it's not the korban itself, it's the balim, but since they can't eat it, it's considered to be inherent in the korban and it's burnt immediately. So we had a machlokes how to understand this machlokes. Is this where the balim became tummy before Zrika, or they became Tomei after Zrika? So Rav Yochanan said that Af la'achar Zrika nami machlokes. He says that the machlokes is even after the Zrika. Meaning, the way Tosfos explained it is that Rav Yochanan Baruch holds that even if the Baal became Tomei after Zrika, meaning that there was a moment in time when this korban was roy, because after the Zrika, it was roy, the Zrika was done, the Baalim was still torn. It was only after the Zrika that it became Tomei, that Rav Yochanan ben Broka, nevertheless, he holds that this is considered inherent in the korban and you burn it immediately. Where the Rabbanan hold that even if it became Tomei prior to the Zrika, then the Tanna Kama holds it's still, even if they became Tomei prior to the Zrika, so there was never a Shas Kaiser, it's still considered external, and you have to wait till the next day. So Vaz Rav Yochanan Tomei, the Rav Yochanan who explained it and said Af la'achar Zrika nami machlokes, he follows his own opinion. Dam Rav Yochanan ben Broka, Rav Nechemia Amud Yomi, they go with the same shita. They said the same thing. Rav Yochanan ben Broka Hadam, we just mentioned, and Rav Nechemia Mai. What's the shita of Rav Nechemia? So the Sanya we learned in the Baraisa, Rav Nechemia Aimer, he says Vibnei Aninos Nisrafazu. He says that in the Maisa with Aaron, and the day that the Shmini Lamula, the day that Nadav Avihu died, and the Chatas Rosh Chodesh was burnt. So there's a dispute, why was it burnt? And he holds that the reason that it was burnt was because of Aninus, that since Nadav Avihu died, the Aaron and his sons were oinanim. And an oinen is also to eat from the korban. Even though the Kohen Gadol is makriv oinen, oinen means the day that one of the 7 relatives died, the day of the Misa, even though a Kohanim are also to be makriv and oinen, but a Kohen Gadol is mutter to be makriv oinen. So over here, they were oinen and they could not be eaten. The korban could not be eaten, and therefore that's why it was burnt. L'kach nemar ka'ela, and that's why it says ka'ela. And the pasuk says that Aaron said to Moshe Rabbeinu, "Vatikranu isi ka'ela." If this happened to me, would it be pleasing to Hashem? Meaning, there was a hayra that the other korbanos, that were special korbanos for the day that the mincha, the oila, the shlamim, that were the chayvus hayayim, were only for that time, for the chanukas hamizbeach, they were to be eaten. But Aaron concluded that's only over there because they were special korbanos for the day, for the special day. But the soyer in question over here was a soyer Rosh Chodesh. That was a korban of L'dairis. It wasn't specific to this day. And there he concluded that the din is, like other cases of an oinen, that an oinen cannot eat the korban. So therefore the korban could not be eaten, and therefore he burnt it. So that's why it says, L'kach nemer ka'ela. So that's why he learns from the Nechemia that was the Maisa over here. Now, Haninas Kalachar Zrika. Haninas is considered like Achar Zrika, meaning even though they were oinanim before the Zrika, Nadav Avihu died previously, prior, but it's considered like after Zrika. Why is it considered after Zrika? Because this is a chatos that comes, it's not like a korban Pesach that has to be eaten. This is a chatos that the Zrikas Adam comes for a kapara. And therefore, as long as you can do the zrika sadam, even if the korban cannot be eaten, you can do the zrika and it comes for a kapar. So now over here, even though the aninus is before zrika, but it's like after zrika, because the korban you can still be makrabit, and therefore it's still considered to be that the korban had a shasakaisha. Nevertheless, v'chi israf la'alter israf. And nevertheless, it was burned immediately. You don't say that, well, it wasn't over there that they waited till the next day to burn it. They burnt it on that day. They burnt it immediately. So therefore you see that he equates the two, and therefore you see that equating the two, he considers it to be, therefore, even lachar zrika, also it's machlokes, and it goes with the shita of Rav Yochanan ben Broka. The Rav Chemia is the same sheet as Rav Yochanan ben Broka. And Rama Maisav af Rav Yosef Glili, he added on to the list, which Rav Yochanan didn't, but he added even Rav Yosef Glili. The same because it was in the rights of Rav Yosef Glili, I'm Kola Inyan Kula, Eno Davar El Apartment, Srafim, Sirin, Srafim. Lisrei Psulema Besabira. He says that the pasuk that we brought down previously, that the pasuk says the whole chatas shayuva midama al oil moed chaver b'kaydish loy seachel be'esh tisarif. Now we interpreted it before, according to different mandamrim, that was referring to that if you have a chatas chitzaina, you have a chatas that is done not in the Kaddish Chadoshim, it's chatas chitzaina. If the blood comes into the oil moed, so it's considered yoytze, it comes chutz mechitzasa, it comes to a place where it shouldn't, then it has to be burnt. But he learned it differently. Basically, learns it differently. He says he learns the pasuk of chata shayuva midam alon mai. It's referring to a chatas pnimi, not that it came in improperly. It's any chatas asher yuva midam alon that the dam is supposed to come into almoy, meaning a chatas pnimi. It's teaching you that this case of a chatas pnimi, it tells you that kol inyan kula in v'derva parman israfim usirman israfim, the chatas pnimius, that lisraf abeis psulim abeis abira, that if they become apostle, then they're burnt, not chutz l'machna, they're burnt on the spot in the base of bira, and v'litin loisasa chilosan, and to include also a loisasa, to eat them when they're kosher, that these things should not be eaten. Now we only know from other psukim, we only know that there's an essay. We only know that there's an essay. We don't know there's a loisasa. So therefore it's teaching you that there's a loisasa to eat it. If it's kosher, there's a loisasa to eat it. And this is the chiddush of the loisasa in when it's kosher, and when it's possible, that it should be burnt a beis abira, and it should be burnt then loisayachal be'esh tisorif. So this is what's coming to teach you. Amru loy the Hofstedter yeseg lili chata shenichnas dama lifnai lifnim nine. Well, how do you know a case where it's a chatas chitzaina, that the blood came inside? How do you know that it has to be, that it's possible? How do you know, if you're not learning this pasuk for a chatas chitzaina, how do you know that a chatas chitzaina where the dam came inside it becomes possible? Amar Len, he said from the following pasuk. It says, Hein lo yehuva es dama el kodesh pneima, from the Maisa with Aaron and Moshe Rabbeinu, by the case of the sire of Rish Chodesh, that it said, Moshe Rabbeinu said, Hein lo yehuva es dama el kodesh pneima. Why was it burnt? You should have eaten it. The dam didn't come inside. Mechlal, which you could infer, that if the blood had gone outside the boundary, inami ayo dama, or alternatively, if the blood came inside, then besreifa. Then you'd see it's besreifa. So you see, even though there's a psul over here, it's not in the bolts or the korban, it's a psul in the dam. We see that that's the way he's learning the parish. That Moshe Rabbeinu is saying, well, why did you burn it? it didn't come, the blood didn't come inside, which is mashma, if it did, then you would have sreifa, and it was burnt. It would be proper that it's burnt immediately. So you see that even though the psul is not in the gufa korban, it's not in the basar, it would still be ton sreifa, and you would have to burn it immediately. But Rav Yochanan did not include Rav Yossi Galili in the list. Why is that? Rav Yochanan is savar dam basar charamilsi. Dam basar charamilsi, the dam and the basar, that's considered to be one thing. Ba'ali milsachriti. So therefore, just because you show that Rav Yossi Galili says this by the dam, but the blood and the basar, that's considered the gufa korban. When we talk about something external, we're talking about the balim. There you have to show me that if it's a psul in the balim, then we consider it, then you would burn it immediately, you would consider it to be not external. But just because you show them by the dam is the same as the basar. So that's a gufa korban. That's not, they say that the Rav Yossi Galili would say it's the same thing if it would be a psul and the balim. Zog the Mishnah, the bones of the korban pesach, or the sinews, or what's nicer, what's left over, Yisrafu b'shisha aser. They're burnt on the 16th of Nisan. So as we'll see in the Gemara, the bones, we're talking about marrow bones. So then the marrow inside is considered edible, and is considered therefore something that has a din of nicer on it. And so we'll see why this is what's involved over here. So why doesn't he eat the marrow? He can't eat the marrow. But just for in general terms, at this point, the Mishnah is saying that if you have the bones, and they have the bones that have the marrow inside, and you can't break the bones, that's some l'sishva boy. You have sinews, and they're nicer because you can't eat them. So then you have the leftover basar, yisra b'shisha also. You have to be burnt on the 16th. But the next day, then they become nicer, they have to be burnt. But chal shish also there's b'Shabbos, if it fell on a Shabbos, then yisra b'shiva also. You can't burn it on that day, you have to wait till the next day, because the 16th is, if it's Shabbos, is burning of the nicer is not doich Shabbos. Lefi she'ena doich and loisa Shabbos v'loisa yontav. Because the mitzvah to burn, they burn the nicer is not doicha, not Shabbos, and not Yontav. Therefore, if you have that which is left over, it's left over to the next morning. If it's the 15th, it can't be burnt on the 15th because it's Yontav. It's burnt on the next day. But if the next day is Shabbos, it can't be burnt on Shabbos either, then it's pushed off till the 17th. If you have bones of kach that serve nicer, that have carrying nicer, for instance, you have marrow bones. So they have marrow in the bone. The marrow is considered basar. It has to be eaten. If it's not eaten, it's therefore nicer. So what is the status of the bones itself? So he said that we treat it like nicer, since it serves the nicer, it holds the nicer. You carry the marrow with it. Therefore, it's treated like nicer, and just like by nicer, there's a din d'Rabbanan. If you touch it, it's matam yadayim. You have to wash your hands. So here also, matam yadayim nasa bosses l'davar also, because it's a bosses. It's the bone facilitates. It's a base for the nicer. Name of Silas Bingaraya from the Mishnah says outside. It's like nicer Yisrael Shisha also, you burn it on the 16th. What's the status of these bones? If there's no marrow, then why do you have to burn it? Nishdino, just throw them away. Meaning, if they're not marrow bones, they're bones, there's no din of burning on bones per se. The Torah says, it's like Mashim Tzai, so the Torah says that don't leave over from anything till the morning. You have to eat the Korban Pesach, and don't leave over to the morning. And what's left over to the morning is burnt. So what you're supposed to eat, and what's not eaten is left over to the next day is burnt. But something which is not edible, then there's no disreif either. So it's partial, we must be talking where it has marrow. Now, if you say that it's nilsa, that the carrying of the serving the nicer is a factor, and we treat it like nicer, that's why it has to be burnt. But if you say that the shimush of the nicer is lav milsa, it's not a factor, why do you have to burn it? Nisbarinu, then break the bone, and break over the bones after it became nicer, and then remove the marrow and burn it, and then throw away the bones. Once there's an isra of etzem loisishvu, you can't break the bone. You can't break the bone, but that's only that before it became nicer. Once it became nicer, there's no isra of breaking the bone. So why don't you say break the bone, remove the marrow, and why you have to bother to burn the bone? The LMI, doesn't that show you that the bone itself, there's a din of nicer on the bone itself? So doesn't that teach you that shimush nicer is milsa? It's considered the bone itself like nicer. Omre, they say like shimush nicer lav milsa. Really, I can tell you that it's not considered nicer, because Savar, when the Torah says etzem loisishavu boy, we darshan boy bekosher v'afilo beposel. So really, I'll tell you no. When the Torah says etzem loisishavu boy, it means that there's an issue to break the bone. And it's not only by a kosher one, it is by a apostle one as well. It applies even to a apostle one. It also, meaning, originally we thought when it says etzem loisishvu boy, it was a miyut. So the way Rashi explained it, we thought it was a miyut. And therefore the Isser applies only to boy, a kosher one. But there's no Isser breaking apostle one. But now we're saying, no, it's not a miyut. It doesn't mean to exclude anything, and the Isser applies whether it's kosher or not kosher, and therefore you can't break the bone and remove the marrow. In fact, the more afilu apostle salkadaita, how can you say that about Tanan? Aval moitzer betor v'ashever betome enu seves arboim. It says clearly in the Mishnah that if you are moitzer betor, if he leaves over some of the meat, that's tor, or if he breaks the bone, and he breaks the bone of a tome, he's not right, doesn't get malchus. So therefore, Meiser B'Toyer is, well, there's no malchus over there because it's a lav nitik lese, or it's a lav shem b'maisa. But why is there no malchus by breaking the bone of the tome? It must be that there's no lav. Our answer is no. Loikash. In our Mishnah, we're talking where there was a shasa kaisha, that it became only tome only afterwards. Then, and initially, it was kosher. Therefore, the isser for breaking the bone, it applies, because once it has a shasa kaisha, the isser takes hold. Now, even though afterwards it became tome, the isser doesn't fall off. But kan shalayas hashta kaisha. But in the Mishnah, that says that if there's no isser, there's no lav of breaking the bone, it's talking where in that case it's talking it was tummy from the outset, so it never became mutter. The isser never took hold. Now you might wonder and say, well, if we're talking about a bone that the isser of etzem loisishvu boy applies to it, and you can't break the bone, so how does the marrow become nicer? If you can't get access to the marrow, it's not edible. So then it becomes something which is not edible, so why is it nicer? Now, it's much from Taisus that breaking the bone is the isser. Taking a coal and burning a hole and removing the marrow would not be asr. So theoretically, it is accessible. However, Taisus says we're not machayev you to do that, to remove the marrow, because number one, we're afraid that you'll come to break the bone, and number two, it's a huge tircha. So the marrow is actually theoretically accessible. So the marrow is therefore nicer, and now we're suggesting over here that the bone, it's a basis for the nicer, also has a din of nicer. Gemara continues the Montana the Shan Leben Shais L'Shasa Kaisher L'Hais L'Shasa Kaisher. Where do we see a Tana who's machalik between whether it has a Shasa Kaisher or not? Gemara says Rabbi Yaakov. The Sanya we learn in the Brayso that's only Sishra boy says you can't break the bone of the Korban Pesach boy because of labor apostle. So we dash and boy it's a meal in the kosher and not an apostle. Rabbi Yaakov Vaimer says no, there's a chilik. If it had a shasa kaisha and then it became possible, there is an isser shirzaz. But loy haisel shasa kaisha ain't by mishma shirzaz. So you see, he's machalik that way. Rav Shimon Aimer echadzeh ain't by mishma shirzaz. And Rav Shimon says, no, there's no difference. There's no difference, and in both cases, ain't by mishum shirzaz. Taisus asks a question, well, it doesn't come out to Rav Shimon, Hainu, the Tanakama. Taisus explains that Rabbi Yaakov and Rav Shimon are explaining, they're arguing, what does the Tanakama mean? It's a machlekes in what the Tanakama means. But Al Koponim, we see over here this chilik between that Haisel Shasa Kaisher or not.